I'm not entirely sure when they started exactly, the nightmares. But for as long as I can remember, I've been plagued by many restless nights. It all started shortly after we moved into my childhood home. It was a looming 2-story house with dark siding that gave it an almost ominous aura. I remember standing outside in the driveway while the movers carried box after box past me. I stood out there for nearly an hour, too afraid to step foot inside. It wasn't until my mother guided me by the hand through that dark threshold that I slowly started to calm down. She led me upstairs to my bedroom at the far end of the hallway. My parents made sure to set my bedroom up first so I wouldn't be overwhelmed by the sudden move. She left me there to go assist the movers who were still carrying boxes inside. As I sat there on my bed, I started to feel claustrophobic. Despite how large my new room was and the imposing nature of this house, it felt like all of the walls were closing in on me. I tried my hardest to ignore it. I even started to read a book to take my mind off things. However, every time my eyes drifted to the pages, I could feel eyes on me from somewhere else. Like someone or something just out of sight was staring at me. I would snap my attention up and look around the room rapidly. Every single time, there would be nobody there. I tried to tell myself that I was just getting used to the new house, and everything might seem scary at first, but it'll ease up eventually. That, unfortunately, wasn't the case, as after a handful of months passed, the nightmares started. The first 2 times were your standard running through the dark being chased by some otherworldly creature, something that wished to drag me back into the darkness, to devour me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, struggling to catch my breath. I, of course, knew what nightmares were and have had them numerous times before. But something about this new house made my mind believe that they were real. The nightmares piled on night after night, my brain seemingly concocting new ways to terrorize me. Then one night, the nightmares stopped. Well, I suppose a better word for it would be changed. No longer was I being chased by monsters, or being swallowed alive by an ocean of black. This time, I was standing alone in a vast open field. All of the colors around me were muted, desaturated, just varying shades of gray and black. Then, the feeling of being watched came over me, but this time it was much more intense. Almost as if there were a million eyes in a gigantic circle around me, all staring at me intently. Then, in the distance, I could see something. Although the sky in my nightmare was dark, I could make out a break on the horizon. It seemed to be a person, but they were so far off I could only just make it out. Then I woke up. What was strange was when I had woken up, only a meager 10 minutes had passed since I had fallen asleep. Though during my nightmare, it felt like hours were whizzing past me as I stood in that field. It took me nearly 2 hours to fall back asleep. I'm not sure why, but for some reason, despite the lack of immediate danger, that nightmare unnerved me far more than the others did. As the weeks resumed, so did my standard nightmares. Various monsters and dangers filled my dreams endlessly. You would think after a handful of consecutive nightmares one would get used to them, but I never did. Every time I would wake up in a panic, sometimes even screaming for my parents. However, occasionally, I'd be transported back to that empty field and see that same silhouette of a person standing at a distance. The creeping feeling of eyes watching my every move, covering my body, and then I'd wake up to find that mere moments had passed. Throughout high school, things hadn't really changed. I was still experiencing restless nights, which resulted in me doing poorly in school. I was unable to focus and stay awake during class, which drew the ire of many of my teachers. Still, I tried my best and I was lucky enough to barely graduate. After I finished school, I had gotten a job working 2 cities away. It was an administrative position for a pharmaceutical company. I was shocked when I had gotten the job, as I figured it would be far out of my wheelhouse. However, I quickly discovered that it had very little to do with any actual medical knowledge. Basically, all I had to do was endlessly process work orders and files. Nearly anyone with knowledge of a computer could do it. So I understood why I was selected. I would also attribute it to my availability. In the latter years of school, I had realized that if I stayed up through most of the night, went to school, and slept immediately when I got home, I wouldn't have nearly as many nightmares as I would have if I slept through the night. So, since they were looking for someone to work the graveyard shift, I jumped at the opportunity. I would show up in mid-evening, work through the night, come home and sleep at dawn. This, in my mind, should have helped ease the nightmares. The only mildly inconvenient aspect of my new job was the location. I had to drive nearly 2 cities away due to the fact that the company headquarters was located there. The road that stretched in between the 2 cities was a single highway. On either side of the road were a mix of fields and farms that pocked the rural landscape. Over the few months I've been working there, I've driven that road numerous times. I usually leave fairly early to avoid traffic and to assure I'm not late for work. When I leave, the sun is on its descent, and by the time I reach my destination, there's nothing in the sky but stars and moonlight. Everything had been going well. I was getting much more accustomed to my job and my coworkers. Honestly, working at night took my mind off of a lot of things. I was able to mindlessly focus on tasks right in front of me, instead of waiting for nightfall to be terrorized by my own mind. Then, yesterday, something happened that I'm not exactly sure how to deal with. The day before work, I was having an odd dream. It wasn't nightmarish in a sense. It was just strange. I was standing in an endless sea of black. There was no field this time. No silhouette. No monsters. Just an empty void. Then, after a few moments, I felt an impending sense of dread starting to swell within me. It mounted and mounted until I was physically doubling over with anxiety. Then I woke up. When I did, I noticed the sky was much darker outside than it usually was whenever I'd wake up. I quickly checked my phone and felt my heart plummet in my chest. I had overslept by nearly 3 hours. In a daze-filled rush, I grabbed everything I needed for work and sprinted out to my car. I was still wiping the fatigue from my eyes as I was driving away from my home. Nearly 20 minutes had passed before I turned onto the long stretch of road that takes me to the next city. I hadn't really driven this road so late at night before, so I was trying my best to get my bearings. After I felt alert enough, I started to calm down a bit. That's when I began to notice how sparse the road was. Typically, when I head to work, there are still many commuters trying desperately to get home despite the early start. I was surprised if I spotted more than 2 vehicles at any given time. After an hour, the small number of cars began to take turnoffs heading into various towns along the way. It wasn't too long until I was the only car left on this long stretch of road. When I was around halfway to the next city over, my phone suddenly started to ring on the passenger seat next to me. The sudden sound diverted my attention and I frantically reached over to retrieve it. When I did, my eyes drifted back to the road ahead of me. And that's when I saw someone standing in the center of the road. My headlights flashed over them briefly, but it was enough for me to recognize the danger, and I pulled the wheel hard to the right. I slammed my foot into the brakes, and my car skidded and squealed to a stop. I had just narrowly missed the ditch along the side of the road. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly as I stared wide-eyed to my left and right. I quickly opened my car door and stepped out into the gravel shoulder. I looked back down the road and I couldn't see anyone standing there. Even though it was fairly dark outside, the sky was clear and the moon was shining brightly. That's when I started to have a feeling creep up my back to my neck. It was a feeling I had felt many times in my life, and it's always been when I was asleep. The feeling of millions of eyes watching me. The skin on my arms prickled as I nervously glanced around. After scanning for a few moments, my eyes finally locked onto something in the distance. Out in the field, where I nearly drove my car, I could see someone. There was no civilization on this section of road, no towns, no turnoffs. So to see someone clearly standing out there was unsettling. I shut my eyes thinking that I might actually be sleeping and tried to force myself awake. When I opened them, I just felt a chilled breeze brush my cheek as I was still standing next to my car. However, when I redirected my attention back on the figure, they were gone. I could feel a weight start to fall off my shoulders. But then I realized that the lingering feeling of being watched had never ceased. That's when I felt an icy cold breath cascade on the nape of my neck. I spun on my heels and looked behind me. I was standing face to face with a man, though his sudden appearance forced me to step back. His eyes were massive, nearly twice the size of an average person's. He stood wearing a neatly pressed black suit, which made his expression even more disturbing. His face was contorted into the widest smile I had ever seen anyone make. 2 rows of crooked yellow teeth split his entire face in half. He stood motionless, just looking at me with those enormous eyes. I could feel my palms turn clammy and my breath become shallow. His teeth split apart, and he spoke 3 words to me. 3 words which resonated in my very core. 3 words which summed up every single nightmare I've had up until then.
I see you.
When he said this, I nearly lost my balance. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was stand there before this person, frozen with fear. He then revealed a hand that had been partially obscured by his sleeve, and reached out for me. As his hand drew near, I got the feeling that I was in immediate danger, that his hand was going to kill me if it touched me. His hand then rested upon my shoulder, and I flinched and shut my eyes. When I opened them, my vision was partially obscured by a bright light. I thought I was dead. After a moment, my sight cleared and I saw a man standing in front of me. A different man. He sported a concerned expression and asked me if I was alright. Very quickly, I was able to piece together that this Samaritan spotted me on the side of the road and decided to help. I shook my head and told him that an animal darted out onto the road and I nearly lost control of my car. He chuckled at me, noting that the same thing had happened to him once or twice before. I thanked him for the kind gesture of checking up on me, and assured him I was fine. He nodded to me, wished me safe travels, and returned to his car and drove away. I stood there for a few moments, watching his headlights drive past me and disappear along the road. I took a deep breath and exhaled. When I did, I looked down at the road, and something caught my eye. There were footprints in the gravel in front of me. They turned and seemed to walk off into the field to my left. I'm fairly sure the Samaritan didn't walk out there, and I know I didn't. And if I was just having some kind of hallucination, then who could have made those prints? I quickly shuffled my way back inside my car and shut the door. I started the engine, and when my radio turned on, I noticed something extremely odd. The clock said it was nearly midnight. Yet when I had received a call from work, it was at roughly 8 p.m. I had been standing out there for close to 4 hours straight, though from my perspective, the interaction lasted only 10 minutes or so. I called my work and told them that I'd be taking a sick day and made my way back home. All day I've been racking my brain about what I had experienced, and have tried to rationalize what I saw, but there have been no logical courses of thought. I have no idea if what I saw the previous night was real or not. I don't know who that grinning man was, or if he was just a product of my imagination. The only thing I know for sure is that for the first time in a long time, I am terrified to fall asleep again.